Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening.
Officer, on what grounds? The detector didn't alert. Explain the cause.
It's a random check. Cooperate.
Then state the policy you're following. On camera.
Of course. Here is the complete story with all major and minor titles removed, presented as a single, continuous narrative. The world of Judge Marcus Williams was a world of meticulously constructed order. It existed in the precise alignment of the books on his mahogany shelves, in the crisp, symmetrical knot of his silk tie, and in the unwavering cadence of his voice as he delivered rulings from the federal bench. At 52, he had cultivated a life that was a fortress against the chaos he adjudicated daily. His reputation in the legal community of the Fourth Circuit was legendary, a jurist of formidable intellect, unassailable integrity, and an almost frightening level of preparation. Defense attorneys spoke of the Williams Gauntlet, a trial where every motion was scrutinized, every piece of evidence weighed with microscopic precision. Prosecutors, while often benefiting from his intellectual rigor, feared his intolerance for sloppy casework or constitutional overreach. He was stern, yes, but his sternness was the product of a profound respect for the law, a respect born from a life spent witnessing its power to both build and destroy. His mornings began not with the clang of an alarm, but with the gentle, pre-dawn light filtering through the bay window of his colonial-style home in a quiet, tree-lined suburb. At 5 a.m., while the world slept, Marcus would be in his study, a cup of black coffee steaming beside him, reviewing the day's docket or preparing for travel. This Tuesday in November was no different. He was scheduled for an early flight to a judicial conference in Chicago, where he was slated to lead a panel on sentencing reform. His wife, Elena, also an attorney and now a partner at a prestigious corporate law firm, joined him in the kitchen just before 6 a.m. She moved with a quiet grace that complemented his stoic intensity. They had met in law school, two ambitious students who saw in each other a shared dedication to excellence. 25 years later, their partnership was a seamless blend of mutual respect and deep, unspoken understanding. "You have that look," she said, leaning against the marble countertop as she watched him secure the latches on his briefcase. "What look is that?" he asked, his focus still on his task. "The I am about to go impose order on the universe look," she teased gently. "Don't forget to eat something on the plane. You know how you get when your blood sugar drops." He finally looked up, and the stern faade of the judge melted away, replaced by the warm, affectionate gaze of a husband. "I will be fine, Elena. It's a 2-hour flight." "It's not the flight I'm worried about," she said, her smile fading slightly. "It's the getting there. You know how airports can be." It was a conversation they had had many times. Despite his status, his impeccable dress, and his calm demeanor, travel remained a space of unpredictable friction. They were a successful black couple in America, and they understood that their success did not grant them immunity from the silent, insidious currents of prejudice. It often made them a more conspicuous target. "I know the drill," he said, giving her a reassuring kiss. "I'll call you when I land." As he drove to the airport in the pre-dawn darkness, the city lights a distant, blurry constellation, he reflected on Elena's words. He had mastered the art of navigating these spaces, maintain a professional but unremarkable presence, be polite but firm, never show frustration. It was a second set of rules he had to live by, one not codified in any law book but learned through decades of experience. He was Judge Marcus Williams, a man who commanded a federal courtroom. But in the anonymous, transient world of an airport terminal, he knew that to some, he would be seen as something else entirely. He just never imagined how true that would be on this particular day. Danny Rodriguez hated mornings. He hated the shrill beep of his 4:30 a.m. alarm, the stale taste of instant coffee, and the weary resignation on the faces of the early morning travelers he screened. For 8 years, he had been a Transportation Security Administration TSA officer, a job he had taken after a failed attempt to join the local police force. He wasn't a bad person, he told himself, but a quiet bitterness had taken root in him over the years. He saw himself as a guardian, a thin line of defense against unseen threats, but the public saw him as an inconvenience. They saw the uniform, not the man. His supervisor, Janet Pierce, was a different breed. A 15-year veteran of the TSA, Pierce had risen to her supervisory role through a combination of dogged persistence and a cynical understanding of the airport's bureaucracy. She was a woman who felt perpetually overlooked, her ambition thwarted by what she perceived as a system that favored younger, more polished candidates. Her authority over her checkpoint was absolute, a small kingdom where her word was law. On that Tuesday morning, Pierce and Rodriguez shared a brief, wordless exchange over lukewarm coffee in the break room. They had developed a kind of shorthand, a shared understanding built on mutual resentment. They had a game they played, a way to break the monotony of the long shifts. They called it Spot the Peacock. It was a cynical exercise in profiling, targeting travelers who, in their eyes, seemed too big for their britches. The targets were almost always well-dressed minorities. A black man in a tailored suit, a Hispanic woman with an expensive handbag, an Asian man with a luxury watch. These were the peacocks who, they believed, needed to be reminded that in their checkpoint, everyone was the same. Slow morning, Rodriguez grumbled, watching the sparse line of passengers trickle through. It'll pick up, Pierce said, her eyes scanning the travelers with a practiced, predatory gaze. Just keep your eyes open. You never know when a peacock might strut through. When Judge Marcus Williams stepped into their line, immaculate in his navy blue suit, Rodriguez felt a familiar jolt. The suit was expensive, the briefcase was genuine leather, and the man carried himself with an air of quiet confidence that Rodriguez instinctively translated as arrogance. He didn't see a judge or a professional, he saw a target. He glanced at Pierce, raising an eyebrow. She saw Williams, and a slow, cruel smile touched her lips. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The game was on. Williams placed his belongings in the plastic bin with practiced efficiency. He walked through the metal detector, which remained silent. As he began to reassemble his life on the other side, slipping on his polished shoes, reaching for his briefcase, he felt the first ripple of disturbance in his orderly world. Rodriguez was approaching, his expression a blank mask that failed to hide the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Sir, Rodriguez began, the word stripped of any respect. I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening. The words hung in the sterile air, a stark and dissonant note in the quiet symphony of the morning terminal. For Judge Williams, the carefully constructed order of his world was about to be systematically dismantled. Judge Williams looked up at Officer Rodriguez, his mind processing the request with the speed of a legal analysis. There had been no alarm. His bags were standard. He had followed every instruction. The request was, by all objective measures, baseless. Is there a problem with one of my items? He asked, his tone impeccably neutral. He was gathering facts, establishing a record. We just need to conduct additional screening, Rodriguez repeated, the phrase a robotic mantra. He was not accustomed to being questioned. He was used to the immediate, anxious compliance of travelers who feared missing their flights. This resistance, however polite, was an unexpected variable. It flustered him. Williams, sensing the officer's uncertainty, pressed his advantage, not with aggression, but with logic. Can you specify what triggered the need for this screening? He asked. Was there a positive test for residue on my bag? An anomaly on the X-ray? Rodriguez stammered, his eyes darting toward Pierce for support. It's its standard procedure. Williams knew it was not. He had read the TSA's own published guidelines. He knew that secondary screenings were to be prompted by specific triggers or a truly random, computer-generated selection process. This felt like neither. I'd like to speak with your supervisor, Williams said, his voice quiet but firm. It was not a request, it was a directive. Pierce stepped forward, her body language radiating a defensive hostility. She had been observing the entire interaction, her annoyance growing with each question Williams asked. I'm Supervisor Pierce. Is there a problem? She asked, her tone implying that he was the problem. Williams introduced himself, omitting his title for the moment. He was a citizen, a traveler, and he wanted to be treated as such. I'm Marcus Williams. Your officer has selected me for a secondary screening, and I'm trying to understand the basis for that decision. Nothing in the primary screening indicated an issue. Pierce's response would become the cornerstone of the entire case against her. Sir, selections for additional screening are made on a completely random basis, she said, the lie delivered with practiced ease. Williams's eyes swept the checkpoint. He pointed subtly to a group of white businessmen in similar attire who had passed through after him without incident. I seem to be the only random selection in the last 10 minutes. I find that statistically improbable. The challenge to her authority, delivered with such calm precision, ignited a fuse in Pierce. Her professionalism evaporated, replaced by raw animosity. Sir, questioning our security procedures is, in itself, suspicious behavior. It suggests you have something to hide. It was a breathtakingly circular and illogical accusation, a tactic designed to intimidate and silence. A small muscle at the corner of Williams's eye began to twitch. It was a tell his wife recognized, a sign that his formidable patience was being converted into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He was no longer just a traveler being inconvenienced. He was a guardian of the law witnessing its flagrant abuse. I see, he said softly. May I have your full name and badge number, please, Supervisor Pierce? She gave them reluctantly, the syllables clipped. Janet Pierce, badge number 7842. And Officer Rodriguez's information? Danny Rodriguez, 9125, the officer mumbled, shifting his weight uneasily. Thank you, Williams said, his voice still calm. And for the record, this entire area is under video surveillance, is it not? Pierce's eyes narrowed. She had walked straight into his trap. Yes, it is, she confirmed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. At that moment, Rodriguez returned with a hand-held metal detecting wand, his confidence slightly restored by the prospect of physical action. Arms out to the side, please. Legs apart. As Williams complied, he made a decision. The informal inquiry was over. The official documentation would now begin. He reached into his suit pocket, retrieved his cell phone, and activated the video recorder. The small red light was a beacon of accountability in the dim fluorescent lighting. What do you think you're doing? Pierce snapped, taking a step forward. You are prohibited from recording the screening process. It's a security risk. That is incorrect, Supervisor, Williams stated, his voice now carrying a hint of the authority he wielded in his courtroom. I am in a public area of the airport, and federal appellate courts have repeatedly affirmed the First Amendment right of citizens to record public officials performing their duties in a public space. If the TSA is concerned about its procedures being recorded, perhaps it should re-evaluate the procedures themselves. He had just cited case law. Pierce and Rodriguez were hopelessly out of their depth. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. They were no longer in control. He was. The pat-down was invasive and unnecessarily thorough, but it yielded nothing. Rodriguez then turned his attention to the briefcase, announcing it would need to be searched by hand. With the phone's camera rolling, Williams watched as Rodriguez opened the case and began to remove its contents with a careless disdain. Legal briefs, a bound copy of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, his laptop, and finally, a small, black leather wallet. Rodriguez picked up the wallet and began flipping through it. He pulled out a driver's license, credit cards, and then a laminated card with a gold seal. He stared at it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He read the words slowly, his lips moving silently. United States Federal Judge, Fourth Circuit, Honorable Marcus Williams. The color drained from his face. His hands began to tremble. He looked up at Williams with an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. He spun around and shoved the ID in Pierce's face, his hand shaking. Janet, look, he whispered, his voice cracking. Pierce snatched the ID. For a brief, silent moment, the world seemed to stop. The full, catastrophic weight of their mistake descended upon her. They had not targeted a peacock. They had targeted a federal judge. A man whose entire life was dedicated to the system they were currently making a mockery of. Panic gave way to a desperate, foolish pride. She saw the other travelers watching, some now recording on their own phones. She saw Williams's camera, a single, unblinking eye capturing her humiliation. To retreat now, to apologize, would be a public admission of a massive error in judgment, an error rooted in prejudice. So she made the decision that would seal her fate. She handed the ID back to Williams, her expression a mask of defiance. It doesn't matter who you are, she announced, her voice artificially loud for the benefit of the audience. No one is exempt from security screening. We will proceed. Judge Williams closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He had given them an opportunity to de-escalate. They had refused. He took a deep, steadying breath. He would not use his title as a shield. Instead, he would let them continue. He would let them build the case against themselves, brick by incriminating brick. Because he now understood with perfect clarity, what was happening to him was not just about him. It was a systemic rot, and he had just been handed the tools to excise it. The search became an act of punitive harassment. Pierce, driven by a desperate need to find something, anything, to justify their actions, instructed Rodriguez to escalate. Check the laptop. Power it on. Williams complied, entering his password. Rodriguez, with Pierce peering over his shoulder, began clicking on desktop files. He opened a document titled Sentencing Memo, U.S. v. Salazar. He was now viewing confidential judicial materials, information protected by law. This was no longer just a violation of protocol, it was a potential federal crime. Close that, Pierce hissed, finally realizing they had blundered into a legal minefield. But the damage was done. The line had been crossed, and Judge Williams had it all on video. Finally, after 25 agonizing minutes, the charade was over. There was nothing to find. Rodriguez repacked the briefcase clumsily. Pierce handed it back to Williams. "The screening is complete," she said, her voice tight with suppressed rage. "You are free to proceed to your gate." Judge Williams took his time. He meticulously rearranged the contents of his briefcase, his movements calm and deliberate. His flight was already boarding, a fact that no longer concerned him in the slightest. He had a far more important destination in mind. He approached Pierce one last time. The air around him had changed. The weary traveler was gone. In his place was the formidable jurist, the man who held lives and liberties in his hands. "Supervisor Pierce," he said, his voice low and resonant, "I will require the contact information for the head of airport security, the name of the TSA's regional director, and a copy of the official complaint form." Pierce stared at him, bewildered. Why do you need that?" A smile touched Judge Williams's lips for the first time. It was not a smile of warmth or humor. It was the predatory, chilling smile of a hunter who has just cornered its prey. "Because," he said, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper, "I intend to file a formal complaint. And I suspect, by the time I am finished, it will be the last complaint of this nature you will ever have to deal with." Marcus Williams did not catch his flight. Instead, he found a quiet corner in a nearby airport CAF, ordered a coffee he had no intention of drinking, and transformed the small table into a command center. The adrenaline of the confrontation had subsided, replaced by a cold, methodical fury. He was no longer the victim, he was the plaintiff, the prosecutor, and the chief investigator of his own case. His first call was to Elena. He recounted the events with the dispassionate clarity of a witness delivering testimony. "Marcus, are you all right?" she asked, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and concern she knew all too well. "I am fine," he replied, and it was true. The humiliation had been a flash of heat, now cooled into a solid core of purpose. "But they are not." "What are you going to do?" "I am going to do what I was trained to do," he said. "I'm going to build a case. An ironclad, inescapable case." His next call was to his assistant, instructing her to cancel his participation in the conference panel and reschedule his return flight for the following day. He needed time. His third call was to Judge Patricia Washington in Chicago. Patricia was a contemporary, another brilliant black jurist who had risen through the ranks. They had often shared stories, commiserating about the unique burdens they carried. "Pat, it's Marcus. I need to ask you something. Have you ever had a difficult experience with the TSA?" A weary laugh came through the phone. "Marcus, which one? The time I was randomly selected for a full pat-down despite having pre-check for the third consecutive flight? Or the time an officer insisted my judicial robe and my carry-on was a suspicious garment?" He spent the next hour on the phone, calling other minority judges and senior attorneys in his network. The stories poured in, a torrent of quiet humiliations and frustrating encounters. A pattern began to emerge, not just of individual bias, but of a systemic culture that viewed successful minorities in transit as anomalies to be scrutinized. He meticulously documented each account, obtaining permission to share their stories. This was no longer just about his 25 minutes of harassment, it was about years of it, endured by dozens of his peers. With a growing file of anecdotal evidence, he made his most important call of the day. He didn't call a civil rights organization or a high-profile attorney. He called the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, a man he knew professionally, a prosecutor named David Chen. David, Marcus Williams. I apologize for the direct call, but I'm at the airport, and I've just been subjected to an incident that I believe warrants your office's immediate attention. It involves potential civil rights violations under color of law by TSA personnel. Chen was initially skeptical. His office was swamped with major criminal cases. A complaint about a rude TSA search was hardly a priority. But as Williams detailed the events, the lack of cause, the lie about random selection, the targeted nature of the stop, and, most critically, the unauthorized access of sealed judicial documents, Chen's tone shifted from professional courtesy to rapt attention. They opened confidential case files? Chen asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. They did. And I have the entire 25-minute interaction on video, Williams replied. There was a pause on the line. Judge, Chen said, his voice now serious, I'm sending 2 FBI agents to meet you at the airport. Don't go anywhere. We need a statement, and we need that video. Special Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's Civil Rights Division was not related to the U.S. Attorney, but she shared his tenacity. A 15-year veteran, she had a reputation for being a meticulous investigator who could peel back the layers of a bureaucracy to find the rot underneath. When she and her partner met Judge Williams in a private airport office, they found not a flustered victim, but a calm, composed man who presented his evidence as if he were arguing emotion in his own courtroom. He provided a detailed, timeline-stamped account of the incident. He handed over the video file from his phone. He gave them the names and badge numbers of Pierce and Rodriguez. And he provided the list of other judges and lawyers who had shared their own stories of similar treatment. Judge, Agent Chen said after reviewing the footage, her expression grim, this is blatant. The way they escalated after seeing your credentials is damning. They were trying to justify their initial stop, Williams analyzed. It's a common pattern in cases of pretextual stops. The initial action is based on bias, and every subsequent action is an attempt to retroactively validate that bias. They were hoping to find something, anything, to make their random selection look legitimate. Agent Chen's investigation moved with astonishing speed. Within hours, she had secured a warrant for the airport's surveillance footage. She and her team spent the next 48 hours sequestered in a viewing room, poring over months of recordings from Pierce and Rodriguez's checkpoint. The video evidence was sickeningly clear. The peacock game was real. They watched as Pierce and Rodriguez systematically targeted well-dressed Black and Hispanic travelers, subjecting them to aggressive, lengthy searches while dozens of white passengers sailed through unmolested. The pattern was so consistent it was practically a written policy. The next step was to understand how this had gone undetected for so long. Chen subpoenaed all traveler complaints filed against the 2 officers over the past 3 years. A thick file landed on her desk. Dozens of complaints, all telling a similar story. And every single one had been dismissed. The signature at the bottom of each dismissal form belonged to the same man, Tom Bradley, the airport's administrator for security operations. Chen decided to pay Mr. Bradley a visit. He was a portly man in his late 50s with a comb-over and a perpetually aggrieved expression. He greeted the FBI agents with a wary defensiveness. We're investigating a complaint filed by a traveler against Officers Pierce and Rodriguez, Chen began, keeping her tone neutral. Ah yes, the judge, Bradley said with a dismissive wave of his hand. A misunderstanding. He was being difficult, questioning procedure. My officers followed protocol. We've reviewed dozens of complaints against those 2 officers, Chen countered, sliding a summary sheet across the desk. All of them alleged discriminatory screening. All of them were dismissed by you for insufficient evidence. Can you walk me through your investigative process for these complaints? Bradley began to sweat. We interview the officers, review their reports, they're good officers. Thorough. Sometimes, certain travelers are just looking for special treatment and get upset when they don't get it. Chen leaned forward, her eyes cold. We've reviewed the surveillance footage, Mr. Bradley. Their thoroughness seems to be reserved almost exclusively for minorities. We've also pulled your internal performance reviews. You gave both Officer Pierce and Supervisor Pierce commendations and bonuses for their high number of secondary screenings. It seems you were rewarding them for this behavior. Bradley's face turned pale. He had built a fortress of paperwork to protect his favorite officers, a system that punished victims for complaining and rewarded predators for their aggression. He never imagined the FBI would come knocking, armed with the one thing he couldn't control, irrefutable video evidence. The final nail in the coffin came from a warrant for the officers' personal cell phones. The forensic team extracted a treasure trove of text messages between Pierce and Rodriguez. They were filled with racist jokes and derogatory comments about travelers. Rodriguez got another peacock at 8 o'clock. Fancy suit, thinks he owns the place. Pierce, give him the full treatment. Make him late for his important meeting. Pierce, these fancy-dressed thugs think their money buys them a pass. Not at my checkpoint. Rodriguez, LOL. I love putting them in their place. Agent Chen read the messages, a cold fury rising within her. This wasn't just implicit bias or a flawed system. This was malicious, intentional, and racially motivated harassment, coordinated and covered up by their superior. This was a criminal conspiracy. While the FBI built its criminal case, Judge Williams and his newly retained civil rights attorney, Michelle Roberts, prepared to launch the civil assault. Roberts was a legal powerhouse, known for her brilliant courtroom strategies and her refusal to be intimidated by powerful institutions. They picked the wrong man to mess with, Marcus, she said during their first strategy session. They assumed you were just another target. They didn't realize they were handing a weapon to a master swordsman. Their strategy was twofold. First, they would use the media to exert maximum public pressure. Roberts had a trusted contact, an investigative journalist named David Foster who had a Pulitzer for his work on institutional corruption. They gave Foster an exclusive, including a carefully edited, anonymized portion of Williams's video and the accounts from the other judges. The story exploded onto the national stage. The headline, "Federal Judge Targeted in Apparent Racial Profiling Incident at Airport," was devastating. Cable news channels played the clip on a loop, the calm, dignified judge being harassed by the sneering, unprofessional officers. The optics were a public relations nightmare for the airport authority and the TSA. The airport's initial response was a disaster. They issued a boilerplate statement about following procedure and unfounded allegations. This only fueled the fire. Pundits and politicians from across the spectrum condemned the incident. The hashtag Justice for Judge Williams began trending on social media. With the public outcry at a fever pitch, Michelle Roberts filed the federal lawsuit. It was a legal work of art. It named Pierce, Rodriguez, and Tom Bradley as individual defendants, accusing them of violating Williams's 4th and 14th Amendment rights. It also named the airport authority, alleging a pattern of deliberate indifference and a failure to train and supervise its employees, effectively creating a policy of discrimination. The lawsuit was a bombshell, detailing not just Williams's experience but also including sworn affidavits from the other judges and lawyers he had contacted. It presented a powerful narrative of systemic, targeted harassment against successful minorities. The airport authority, now facing a full-blown crisis, suspended Pierce, Rodriguez, and Bradley pending the outcome of the investigation. But it was too little, too late. The narrative was set, and they were the villains. Their lawyers knew they were in an almost unwinnable position. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was brutal. Michelle Roberts was relentless. She deposed dozens of airport employees, uncovering a deeply ingrained culture of cynicism and racial bias. But the main events were the depositions of the defendants themselves. Rodriguez was first. Dressed in an ill-fitting suit, he sat across from Roberts, a broken and pathetic figure. His swagger was gone, replaced by a sullen fear. He mumbled his way through his testimony, claiming he couldn't recall his motivations, that he was just following orders. "Whose orders, Mr. Rodriguez?" Roberts pressed. "Supervisor Pierce's orders to give him the full treatment?" She slid a printout of his text message across the table. He stared at it, his face crumbling. The deposition was over in under an hour. Pierce's deposition was the climax. She entered the room with a defiant bravado, her lawyer whispering instructions in her ear. She tried to stick to the script. It was a random search. The judge was uncooperative. She was concerned about security. Roberts let her talk, patiently building the trap. Then, she moved in for the kill. Supervisor Pierce, you testified that your actions were based solely on security protocols and not on the passenger's race. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. So, the fact that Judge Williams was a well-dressed black man had absolutely nothing to do with your decision to single him out? Absolutely not, Pierce said, her voice dripping with indignation. That's interesting, Roberts said, her voice dangerously soft. Because in a text message to Officer Rodriguez on the morning of the incident, you referred to a passenger you intended to target as a fancy-dressed thug. Were you referring to Judge Williams? Pierce's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection. This is harassment. It's a question, counsel. And it goes directly to discriminatory intent, Roberts said, her eyes locked on Pierce. Were you, or were you not, referring to a federal judge as a thug? Pierce stared at the printed text message on the table. Her defiant facade shattered, revealing the bitter, prejudiced woman beneath. She refused to answer. The silence was her confession. Judge Williams's deposition was the final act. The airport's high-priced defense attorney tried to paint him as an arrogant, entitled man who used his position to bully the officers. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. With the calm, precise authority of the bench, Williams walked the attorney through every second of the video. He cited specific TSA regulations that Pierce and Rodriguez had violated. He explained the legal doctrine of attorney-client privilege and judicial confidentiality that they had breached by opening his laptop files. He was not a victim testifying, he was a professor of law, and the defense attorney was his struggling student. You claim your clients were just doing their jobs, Williams concluded, his gaze unwavering. Let me be clear. Their job is to ensure the safety of the traveling public within the constraints of the United States Constitution. What they did that day was not security. It was a targeted, unlawful assault on a citizen, predicated on racial bias. They were not doing their jobs. They were, in fact, committing a crime. The case never saw the inside of a courtroom. Faced with the damning depositions, the irrefutable video evidence, the mountain of internal documents uncovered by the FBI, and the looming threat of a massive jury verdict, the airport authorities' lawyers waved the white flag. The settlement negotiation was not a negotiation, it was a surrender. Michelle Roberts and Judge Williams didn't just want money, they wanted fundamental, systemic change. The final settlement was for $8.5 million. But the financial component was the least important part. The binding, court-enforced consent decree was Williams's true victory. It included 1. Immediate termination, the firing of Janet Pierce, Danny Rodriguez, and Tom Bradley, with a permanent note in their records preventing them from ever working in law enforcement or security again. 2. Systemic reforms, a complete overhaul of the airport's secondary screening procedures, implementing a computer-based, auditable random selection system to eliminate officer discretion. 3. Mandatory training, comprehensive, ongoing anti-bias and de-escalation training for all TSA personnel, developed in consultation with civil rights experts. 4. Independent oversight, the creation of a new, independent civilian oversight board with the power to investigate traveler complaints, subpoena documents, and recommend disciplinary action. 5. Data transparency, a requirement for the airport to collect and publicly release quarterly data on the race and ethnicity of all passengers subjected to secondary screenings to monitor for discriminatory patterns. It was one of the most comprehensive reform packages ever agreed to in an airport security lawsuit. It would become known in legal circles as the Williams Mandate. Judge Williams announced he would be donating his entire share of the settlement, after legal fees, to a newly established foundation dedicated to funding civil rights litigation against transportation authorities. The money was never the point, he told the press. The point was accountability. The point was to ensure that what happened to me will not happen to another citizen passing through this airport. The ripples of the case spread far and wide. Tom Bradley was indicted by a federal grand jury. Facing overwhelming evidence, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law. At his sentencing, Judge Williams sat in the back of the courtroom, a silent observer. Bradley was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. The message was clear: administrators who enable and cover up discrimination will be held personally and criminally liable. Janet Pierce and Danny Rodriguez found themselves unemployable and ostracized. Their names were synonymous with racial profiling. Rodriguez ended up working the night shift as a security guard at a desolate warehouse, a shadow of the man who had once wielded power over others. Pierce moved to another state and took a job in retail management, the bitter irony of her new position serving customers of all backgrounds a daily reminder of her fall from grace. Agent Sarah Chin used the success of the investigation as a blueprint. The techniques she used to uncover the systemic corruption at this airport were adopted by FBI field offices across the country, leading to similar investigations and reforms at other major hubs. She was promoted and eventually asked to testify before Congress about the need for greater federal oversight of the TSA. Judge Williams returned to his courtroom. The experience had changed him. He had always been a fair judge, but now he presided with a deeper, more profound understanding of how easily power could be abused and how vulnerable ordinary citizens were in the face of a flawed system. His colleagues noticed a new dimension to his rulings in civil rights and police misconduct cases, and empathy forged in the fire of his own ordeal. One evening, months after the settlement, he and Elena sat on their porch, watching the sunset. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "The fight, the publicity, all of it?" He was silent for a moment, watching the last sliver of orange light disappear below the horizon. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "But I do not regret the fight. There are two kinds of laws, Elena. The ones written in books, and the ones written on people's hearts. Sometimes, you have to use the first to change the second." He had faced down an abuse of power not with anger, but with the very tools the system had given him: logic, evidence, and an unshakable faith in the law he had sworn to uphold. The officers at the checkpoint had looked at a distinguished black man and seen a threat to their authority. They had tried to put him in his place. Instead, in their arrogance and their prejudice, they had handed him the power to dismantle their corrupt world and build something better, and more just, in its place. The echo of their catastrophic mistake would resonate in airports across the nation for years to come, a lasting testament to the day they profiled the wrong man.